Okay, so this is a very simple, small-scale aquaponics system, okay? And we talked in our soil discussion earlier about ecosystems. And an ecosystem happens when you have abiotic, which are non-living things, that interact with biotic, or living things. And they impact each other, okay? So we have, over at the middle school, we have a big 200-gallon system. And with the quarantine and pandemic and everything going on, I haven't rigged that up this year. But I have this small-scale one going, which kind of shows the same thing. And the first thing is we have these plants growing up here on the top, and they're called lucky bamboo. And if you can see, there's little roots growing out the bottom. And some of you last year, we had a meeting where I had some really big lucky bamboo plants, and we did cuttings, and we took the little cuttings and we put them in these cups, and we made clones. So all of these 5 plants here all came from the same parent plant. And we simply cloned it by taking cuttings, and lucky bamboo is really good. When you take a cutting, it generates new roots off the bottom. But you can do this with all kinds of plants. You can create clones of tomato plants. You just take a cutting, and the little white hairs on the stem of a tomato plant actually will form new roots. And once though you keep them wet, and after a while you can take those plants and replant them into the ground and make new tomato plants out of them. So these have been cloned, okay? And the way this system works is there's this tube in here, and there's an aerator. And the aerator bubbles water up inside the tube. And it just happens that those bubbles generate just enough pressure to bring some of the water from the tank, and it comes up into this white tray. So the bottom of this white tray is always wet. And water is coming up, and then there's a hole in the tray that allows the water to leak back down. So fresh water is always coming up into the tray and then going back down into the tank. It's cycling that water through. And we call this little system a flood table. And the reason we call it a flood table is we keep it flooded with water. And lucky bamboo, they can grow with their roots submerged all the time. These lucky bamboo plants are doing fairly well with it. Other plants don't like to have their roots submerged all the time, so you might, instead of using an aerator like this, use a water pump that would flood the flood table for, say, like 15 minutes, and then the water pump would shut off, and then the roots would dry out, so they're not wet 24 hours a day. So you can control how wet the roots are on your plants. And then down in here we have a fish, okay? So basically how the system works is, I said it was an ecosystem. So it's got multiple living things in it. First of all, we've got a fish. But also living down here in the gravel and in the water and up here in among the roots and the little stones that the plants are planted in, we have bacteria growing. A couple different species of bacteria, and they're good bacteria. They're going to do good things for us. So we've got fish, we've got bacterial cultures, and we've got plants. And all those things are going to depend on each other for survival. But then we also have abiotic components, right? We have water, we have air. The water has a certain pH or acidity to it, and it's going to have different chemicals in it. And the living and the non-living things impact each other, and it makes a difference. So when you get a system set up like this, where these living things and non-living things are all compatible, you have a functioning ecosystem, because the biotic and abiotic components work together and function together. And up here on the screen, there's this thing called the aquaponics cycle. And here's how the aquaponics cycle works. The cycle is going to start out with fish, right? And we give the fish food. So we'll start there. You feed the fish. And the fish consume the food, and they make waste. They make ammonia. And does anybody notice on this diagram where the ammonia is coming out of the fish? Owen? from the fish's gills. So we get rid of our ammonia when we eat food. Ammonia oftentimes comes from when you break down protein, right? Like you eat meat or nuts and you get protein. When you break that down, ammonia is a waste product of that digestion, okay? Your cat litter box has a real strong ammonia smell because cat urine has a lot of ammonia in it. Well, fish don't really pee. What the fish do is they let the ammonia that's in their bloodstream, the gills, we know, take in oxygen from the water, but the gills also release ammonia out of the fish's blood. So it's a two-way street. It's taking in oxygen, giving away carbon dioxide, and giving away ammonia. That's what gills do. And so that ammonia leaves the fish's gills and goes out into the water. And ammonia has a formula, NH3. Okay? Now, plants can use NH3. So do you notice some of the NH3 comes up here and gets absorbed by, this looks like it's a Swiss chard plant. Okay? So it looks like the Swiss chard plant is absorbing some of the NH3. But Swiss chard doesn't really prefer ammonia. It would like other nitrogen compounds as well to get its nitrogen from. So there's this little bacteria in here named Nitrosomonas. And Nitrosomonas takes the NH3 and it consumes it, does a little chemical reaction, and the Nitrosomonas gets a little energy out of the deal. That's how it survives. And it converts the NH3 to NO2. NO2 is called nitrite. Okay? Now, nitrite is a problem. Nitrite causes a disease in fish called brown blood disease. And what happens is the fish's gills will actually pick up NO2 instead of picking up oxygen. And it kind of makes the, oxygen is what makes the fish's blood red. And if you see blood vessels along the side of your fish, they should be red. They kind of turn brownish in color because they're picking up NO2 instead. So we really don't want NO2 in our tank. So we have another bacterium called Nitrospira or Nitrobacter. There's a couple of different bacteria that can do this. But there's a second bacteria, and that bacteria takes the NO2 and it makes it into NO3. NO3 is nitrate. This is the stuff that's in fertilizer. Ammonia can be in fertilizer too. But this is also the stuff that's in your soil. This is kind of the ideal nitrogen nutrient for plants. So the plants absorb the nitrate and they use it for growth. They make new protein out of it. And then you could take your plant here and turn around and feed it back to the fish, couldn't you? And you also have to bring oxygen into the water for your fish. So this is kind of like, we call it the aquaponics cycle. So you put food to the fish eat the food and digest it. One of their waste products is ammonia. Some of that ammonia goes directly back to the plant, and the plant absorbs it and uses it for a nutrient. But some of that ammonia, and by the way, if you let ammonia build up in your fish tank, ammonia will eventually kill your fish. Okay? Ammonia can be very toxic to fish. And then that ammonia, some of it's absorbed by the plants, some of it gets created into NO2, into nitrite. Remember, nitrite is also toxic to fish, right? The last thing is NO3, and NO3, not toxic to fish. It's the nutrient for the plants. So can you see that the fish depend on the bacteria, right? If the bacteria aren't here, the fish is going to die from ammonia poisoning or nitrite poisoning if this bacteria isn't present. Okay? So the fish are depending on these bacteria. The bacteria are depending on the fish, aren't they? Because if there's no ammonia, they got nothing to eat. The plants are depending on the fish and the bacteria because they need the ammonia from the fish and they need the nitrate from the bacteria. And then the fish depends on the plant because it can eat the plant, right? And make that cycle happen. So when you think about it, all of these organisms are interrelated and interdependent on each other. On top of that, we can also look at the water quality and look at the abiotic components. So when you have a fish in the tank, the fish can change the water's pH depending on the waste that it gives off. The fish is actually changing the chemical composition of the water by adding the ammonia to it. So the water is actually changed by the fish. The fish also uses up oxygen, and the fish needs to get its oxygen from the water. So the water is actually dependent on the living things for its characteristics, and the living things are obviously dependent on the water. So it's not just the living things that are interdependent, it's also the living things and the non-living things. The biotic and the abiotic stuff is all interdependent. So one way we can kind of define this is we can say that an ecosystem, if we were going to define it, it is a system made of interdependent biotic and abiotic components. And this word interdependent is really important. It's not that they're all just living there, it's that they all impact each other and affect each other. And for the system to be functional, you need to have those things all working correctly. And if anything gets out of balance, it can upset the entire ecosystem.